Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige Q&A section, where Derek and I answer all the questions that are too hot to print. This week, we have gotten a question from 3Feds-in-a-Trenchcoat, which is, of course, on our Discord. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the podcast and join the Discord. 3Feds-in-a-Trenchcoat asks, what are Danny and Derek's thoughts on the failures of modern social and protest movements? The 60s and 70s saw substantial legislation accompanying social movements, but I can't really name anything similar for a lot of the hashtag activist or street protest movements of the 10s, that is, the 2010s. Maybe in part because they were largely addressing abuses of power by police and Black Lives Matter, or behavior that was largely already illegal in the hashtag Me Too movement. The one thing I took away from If We Burn, that is Vincent Bevins' If We Burn, was that previous social movements were often backed by highly organized and large organizations, and that you could kind of bypass that requirement to get a modern movement going through social media. Is that mainly why these movements have largely failed to produce any broader structural change within society, or have been unable to fend off reactionaries from undoing progress? I forgot to add something about the crisis of liberalism, but I'm guessing maybe that plays a part. So, Derek, I have thoughts, but why don't you start?
Why don't you go right into your thoughts? Because this question seems to be right up your alley.
Okay, so first of all, I think that challenging.
Also, I'm a little protesting because this person misspelled my name, but that's beside the point.
I always thought it was Derick. I'll allow it.
Really? It's written at the bottom of the screen.
I know,
in
obviously.
Zencastr.
I did not think that. But so I think the fundamental thing that when you look at the history of protest movements in the United States, and let's limit it to the United States as opposed to the entire Western world or global South or wherever, because I think each country has different histories, has different contexts that you can't easily just make broad blanket statements. But I think in the United States, you're going to have a problem if you challenge fundamentals of capitalism and fundamentals of imperialism. I think if you look at the civil rights movement of the sort of classic civil rights movement of the mid 20th century, the long civil rights movement, I think that they were able to get broader agreement on certain issues related to emancipation, related to freedom, and they put their bodies and lives on the line. But one of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. was doing toward the end of his life before he was assassinated was that he was basically embracing explicit anti-imperialism when it came to the Vietnam War. And he was also embracing the Poor People's Movement, the Poor People's March, and sort of really centering class in a particular way. And I guess we'll see with the files that are released or not by Trump. But one of the arguments that people have made over the course of history is that once MLK, after achieving the incredible gains of the civil rights movement, and I don't want to minimize those, like particularly what the great leaders and ordinary people did, and to end Jim Crow or help end Jim Crow, and really finally almost a century after the Civil War, achieve a full, at least procedural emancipation. Obviously, we know there are social and economic inequity still. Is I don't want to underplay that. But critics have said, or not critics, but people have said that as he was moving towards an explicit anti-imperialism and an explicit, if not anti-capitalism, more socialist perspective, that was one of the reasons that he was perhaps, some have claimed, targeted by U.S. state forces. So I think that one does have to appreciate that attacking the sinews of empire or the sinews of capitalism are going to be more difficult. Then I think we need to think about what was the actual response to the protest movements of the 60s and the 70s. And I'm going to focus on the protest movement about which I know the most, and that is the movement against the Vietnam War. And so, in some senses, I think you could point to the student movements, the anti-Vietnam War movements, as being one of the several reasons that the United States, particularly under Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, decided that they really couldn't stay in that war, that they couldn't win that war. It was too much, it was engendering too much social dislocation, too much social chaos for them to do that, definitely. But I also think that those movements have been a bit romanticized in the popular imagination. I think particularly you see in the late 60s, early 70s, the movement did have an effect on the war, particularly it moves the focus of the American campaign away from boots on the ground, which had really defined the Vietnam War in the mid to late 1960s, towards more bombing campaigns, as well as an expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos. And that was definitely due to the fact that Americans don't like seeing American men in particular coming home in body bags. And then the great achievement of the anti-Vietnam movement was really, I think, the ending of the draft, where Congress, I think that the actual procedural thing that happened was not that Congress actually did anything, but they just let the draft lapse, I believe. They didn't vote to reinstate it. And that really was the great achievement of a movement, which, of course, that has the ironic consequence of basically removing the bourgeoisie from fighting the United States' wars, which arguably, in the long term, from a long term perspective, you could say basically allowed the US empire to do what it wanted, because it was able to do so now without genuine political costs, without suffering mass casualties. And this, of course, happens in the early 1970s and is, I think, part of a larger process by which mass society begins to be replaced by a more individualistic, atomized society from the 1970s forward. And so, what I would argue is that when the modern America, when it comes to, let's stick with foreign policy because this is the capacious question, but let's stick with foreign policy. When it comes to trying to understand why anti-imperialist, anti-war movements haven't been particularly effective in U.S. foreign policy, I think the thing that you have to turn to is the making of the modern American state in the 1940s. So I talk about this in my academic research, and I'm thinking about it right now. But in effect, over the course of the early to mid 20th century, there were lots of discussions about what should the public's role be in policymaking, what should public opinion's role be in policymaking. And to make a very long story short, if you want to check this out, you should read my book, Democracy in Exile, where I go into it in depth, or this new volume on Cold War liberalism I have coming out, or this new essay I have coming out on imperialist realism. But in effect, what happens is that there begins to be an elite consensus by the late 1930s that you really can't trust public opinion. Then there's two primary reasons for this. First, there's the response to the Depression. There are bank runs, and in particular, I think, labor militancy, which demonstrated to a lot of the emergent elite, even the New Deal elite, which was, I would say, more liberal than socialist, even though there were socialistic elements in that coalition, even communistic elements in that coalition, demonstrated to an emergent liberal elite that you couldn't really trust the public. But then also, the rise of Nazism, in particular in Germany, was read as an explicit function of mass politics. That Hitler was a cult of personality that had attracted a mass movement, and what this meant to American observers was that mass politics always had the potential to sort of degrade into authoritarianism or fascism. And you actually still see that today. I think this has become a core feature of liberal ideology. The thing that I always point to is that I remember after Trump was elected in 2016, the New Yorker ran a cartoon of a guy standing up on a plane. He had a mustache. He was very clearly supposed to be a member of the quote unquote white working class that everyone was talking about a decade ago, saying, "Let me fly the plane. I know more than the pilot," which was basically like, oh, look at these idiots. Like, the masses don't know what they're doing, and they're going to sort of override expertise. And you still hear it today. Whenever you hear a liberal talk about the mob, what they're essentially saying is that they really don't trust mass democracy. So, how does this relate to our story? What I think happened was that after World War II, from my understanding, really was particularly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and other American territories, was the public was on the side of fighting World War II. There was, of course, debates in the late 1930s and 1940 with the American First Committee, but after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and other territories, Americans are behind this war. What happens after World War II is that American elites pretty quickly transfer their anxieties about Nazism and Hitler onto Joseph Stalin and the Bolsheviks. And there had always been anti-communist strands in U.S. history going back to the 20s. I mean, Woodrow Wilson literally sends troops to fight in the Russian Civil War, but it didn't occupy the center of the American imagination that it did throughout the Cold War period. So American elites transferred their anxieties onto the Soviet Union and Stalin, which, I mean, fair enough. Stalin was not the greatest leader. He was a pretty oppressive guy. It's not so wild to understand why they did that. But they really wanted the American public to commit itself to this decades-long Cold War. And they weren't sure that the American public could do that. If you look at this sort of writings in 1945, 1946, 1947, really to 1949, there's anxieties about will the public so soon after World War II commit itself to fighting a Cold War, not with any nation, but with a nation that had been a real ally, with a nation that had suffered by far the most in World War II, if you're looking at casualty numbers, et cetera. Um, and so this is not the only reason, but one of the elite solution to this problem was that they created a couple of things that basically prevented the public from directly shaping foreign policy. First, there's the official organizations of state, like the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the forerunner to the Department of Defense, which is institutional. These are institutionalized in the 1947 National Security Act. But beyond this, they create these complexes, what people call the military-industrial complex, basically defense contractors and the state, and the military-intellectual complex, think tanks, academic centers, and the state. And in various ways, these diverse groupings effectively insulate the elite from public opinion, that the elite is able to make foreign policy without really referencing public opinion. And so, for example, Henry Kissinger enters state power through the National Security Council. We're seeing it a lot today. The executive has the authority. Elon Musk was not confirmed by anyone, but he has enormous authority, and that's a larger story about the centralization of power in the executive. Okay. So those are the institutions that are existing since the late 1940s that prevent Americans from having a say on foreign policy. And I think particularly after the U.S. elite realized that they wouldn't really be able to fight massive wars like they were able to in World War II in Korea with Vietnam and the large outcry against the Vietnam War, they basically continue to insulate foreign policy decision-making from popular opinion. So what happens is you have the institutions of mass democracy. And I don't mean institutions just like literal organizations, but like social institutions, like a mass protest. You have the institutions of mass democracy overlaid on a society that is becoming increasingly individualistic, increasingly atomized over the course of the 1970s and the rise of neoliberalism, and also a society that has various institutional mechanisms that really do insulate elites from foreign policy decision making. And I think those are the ultimate reasons why it seems like these protest movements aren't able to actually shape things, because the literal structure of the American state prevents them from doing so. And so this is why I'm always talking about this, but this is why I think the left needs to have a theory of the state and a theory of how to reform the state if it wants to basically make things more democratic. Because I don't think when it comes to foreign policy, at least, and really I'm sure you can make similar claims about other issue areas, but I don't know enough about them. But when it comes to foreign policy, we don't live in a mass democracy and haven't for a while. So I think I would question the idea that these 60s and 70s movements had an effect, at least on foreign policy. It's sort of a great effect. I don't think the public has been a driver of foreign policy really ever in American history, and it really hasn't been a driver of foreign policy since World War II. Famously, of course, Congress hasn't declared war since 1942, though the United States has engaged in some form of military intervention about 216 times between, I think it's 1946 and 2019. You could look at this book by Monica Duffy Toft and Sadida Kushi called Dying by the Sword that goes into that. So I think for all of those reasons, it appears that these mass movements don't have. So Derek, I talked for like literally 15 minutes, so there's a lot there. So why don't you, what do you think? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you
I
think I'm
knew
right?
it was right to let you go first on this one. So let me just pat myself on the back for that.
or wrong, as the
I
case
don't.
may
I mean,
be.
I think there's a lot of different reasons why the protests that we've seen over the last, let's say, 25 years haven't worked in the sense that we think of the Vietnam protests or past the civil rights protests having worked in some sense. And I think, you always have to temper that with what does that actually mean? What does success mean in any of these instances? Like the civil rights protests achieved a tremendous amount. Did they achieve full equality? No, we still don't have that. But there's a few things, and I think the most direct comparison is between, and this gets at something you were talking about, is between the Vietnam protests, which I don't think were decisive in getting America out of the war, but were part of the cost benefit analysis that had to be done in the Nixon White House with how much longer can we do this? What kind of penalty are we taking the longer we stay here? And the mass kind of opposition, the growing mass opposition to the war was part of that. compare that to the protests against the Iraq War, which were immediate and large and did nothing to stop the Bush administration from invading Iraq, which turned out to be a disaster and really, ended only when it was apparent that this was just like we were throwing resources and lives and money down a hole. And there was a political cost to it in the form of Barack Obama being elected, basically. Um, and I think the difference between those two protests is that when masses of people came out in the streets in Vietnam, which was a war that involved conscription and widespread suffering, and millions of people watching the nightly news every night and seeing the carnage and the dead bodies coming home and the devastation, you could assume if you were in power that this group of people that's come out in the streets, it's not a majority of Americans, certainly. And, you never get a majority of people to protest anything, but that they represented a majority or a vast number of Americans who weren't coming out in the streets. And I don't think anybody needed to make that same assumption in the case of the Iraq War, because the war didn't touch that many people, because there was no conscription, because people weren't watching, people weren't all watching the same media and consuming the same news the way that they did in the 1970s. And so, it was easier for the Bush administration to just say, yeah, okay, I mean, let these people blow off steam, but we're going to do what we want. And, we're pretty comfortable that we're not going to pay a price for it. And so, they got away with it. Um, the other thing that I would say is, the question talks about this, what social media has done to enable people to organize, to protest, and I guess there is an argument to be made for that. But I also think social media makes these things weaker. Like, it makes the bonds weaker because it juices the level of atomization that we started experiencing in the 80s and 90s to unprecedented levels. Nobody has to talk to anybody anymore. Like, you don't have to leave the house. You just communicate with everybody online, and yeah, you find people with shared interests or a shared cause, and you say, hey, this is something we should do something about. But really, I think the vector where that works is in raising money for something. I don't think it works to get people to mobilize in common cause for a common thing. What you wind up getting, to me, the best example of this is the pink hat protests after Trump's election, which were about everything and nothing and did nothing. Everybody got to vent about the election, which I guess was healthy on some level, get your emotions out. But what effect did it actually have on politics, or the Trump's first term, or really anything? And I think the answer to that is probably pretty minimal. And part of the reason for that is because I think you had everybody just kind of saying, boy, I'm really upset. We should all go out and protest. And you get this organization happening online, but there's no meetings, there's no in-person, kind of coordination. There's no, like, what are we demanding? What's the ask here? There's not really even that much leadership, frankly. It's sort of just a thing that happens, and it passes, right? I mean, there's no follow through. There's no. It seems like the movements that we have now, there's just not as much cohesion to them. And I think social media is a part of that. When you have to actually go out and meet in person with people and organize in person to get these things off the ground, it creates a level of unity that is very helpful, I think, in following through on what the protest is supposed to be about and what your demands are that we just don't have anymore. So I think social media makes it worse in many ways, even if it lowers the barrier to entry, so to speak, for getting a movement off the ground. I think it makes those movements inherently weaker, and this is the result.
Yeah, it's an artifact of an increasingly atomized society. One thing that I do want to add is that the question did address is because the protest movements today aren't connected to highly organized and large organizations. I would say that kind of relates to my point about attacking capitalism and imperialism, in that I do think there was a conscious effort made by the liberal state in the late 1940s to effectively make anything to the left of liberal social democracy illegal, anything to the left of the type of Cold War liberal social democracy, military Keynesian concordat was literally made illegal. You were considered subversive, and you were considered to be anti-American. And I think it's that initial purge, which famously, I believe it's 9 or 11 unions, I forget, of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the organizations, the CIO, they kicked out the communist unions. And so there is an explicit attempt to basically force at least rhetorically transformative movements outside of normal politics. And so once, if you don't have those larger movements, you're not really going to be able to attack the capitalist and imperialist core. And I just want to highlight that's another thing. And one should say, I think those liberal purges made McCarthyism possible, and McCarthy just kind of finished the job of basically expanding it beyond the actual left to liberals who were like, oh no, don't even think about going where a lot of the people who were actually attacked by McCarthy had been communists or socialists in the 30s, and this was like, you're not going to do that again, and had become liberals, and they're like, you're not going to go back. So I think there are no large organizations that really focus on what I would call those core capitalist and imperialist features, which basically makes the type of mass protest movements impossible to succeed. And Derek, one thing I want to add on before throwing it back to you is that I think on the left there has been a tendency to fetishize things like mass protests. That emerges from the new left tradition of the 60s and the 70s. And I think that it is long past due for a strategic and tactical reassessment of the prospects for a deinstitutionalized, very atomized, very weak left, what prospects that has for actual transformation. And we're still, you know, in a moment of strategic reassessment, or I don't think we're in a moment of forward movement, at least not yet.
It's harder. Just, I mean, you come back to this theme over and over again. The fact that there's no mass culture just makes all of this so much harder to get people, even to recognize the same set of problems, let alone to have a solution for what to do about it or what the ideal should be. It just makes it, more and more difficult to achieve that. And I think, it's, well, I mean, I guess I would leave it there. Like that's at the root of so much of this is just how distant we are from one another anymore. It feels like any possibility of improving has to start there. And I think, to your point about the left sort of fetishizing these things, that to me is a function of just having no way forward. Like,
Yeah, I
what
agree.
else is there if you're on the left? There's no political valence. There's nobody in office except like Bernie, who's too old to really get the job done, and probably not as far left on some things as we would like. um but beyond him, like, where's the outlet? Where are the people who are in a position to actually channel this energy in a meaningful political way and get something substantive done? So you're left with, like, let's get everybody out in the streets, but at the end of the day, what does that get you? I mean, I just think it's a function of not seeing any other way forward.
And that's why we need a liberal Joe Rogan. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the podcast. We take these questions on our Discord server in the AP Q&A or Q&A with American Prestige folder. I don't know, which channel. So if you have anything to ask us, please join the Discord and please check that out.
Yeah,
And
and if
thank you
you're
very
already
much.
on the Discord, ask questions. Always need more questions.
Yeah. Feel free to ask questions. So thank you all for listening, and keep on rocking in the free world. Bye.
Bye.
That's